Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Judith, for the very kind introduction. And thank you for the great honor of inviting me to come give a keynote address about this very important issue. And I want to speak today about some ideas that we've been developing at Rutgers, and I don't want to claim credit for all of these. This is actually my executive leadership team and the broader cabinet and Jonathan Holloway, the president of Rutgers. We have very vibrant discussions around these topics. But and when you have to write a keynote and you think about a keynote, it really gives you an opportunity to really focus. And I think we're, while I will say that we don't have all the answers, I think we are taking action to try to move the ball forward. And I'm very excited and to get your feedback. One of the things, I'm a human geneticist, so I like to do experiments. And so I feel like in my role as the Senior Vice President for Research at Rutgers, that I'm quite comfortable doing experiments. And if they don't work, then we're not going to do it. But if they do work, something great may arise from that. And I think as you'll see through our talk today, we're doing experiments. So I welcome feedback today. Please connect with me in the meeting. Okay, so Rutgers. Rutgers, I just wanted to give you a quick overview. Rutgers is everywhere in the state of New Jersey. We are an enormous institution. We have more than 70,000 students. We have 22 million square feet of space. We have $872 million of sponsored awards last year, with more than 1,553 different PIs getting a sponsored award. We have campuses in New Brunswick, Camden, Newark, and Rutgers Biomedical Health Sciences, which is located both in Newark and in New Brunswick, Piscataway. I am part of a university-wide office, the Office for Research, so I have oversight over research over the entire institution, and we provide services. And I think it's important to understand our functions and what our mission is. And you heard in Judith's introduction that we support the research, scholarship, and creative endeavors of all Rutgers faculty. And we pursue that mission by convening with research leaders like we are today. We provide integrated user-focused resources, services, and tools to make compliance and make the sort of required aspects of research easier, to make discovery, make innovation easier. And we really partner with faculty very directly. So one of my key values, and I think one of the key values of our office, is this notion of democratizing access to opportunities. And I think this is a lot of what we're talking about when we say DEI, is that there's a lack of democratization of access to opportunities as a society. And so in the research space, I think there's a few key insights here that we have to be very conscious of, and I think it's worth stating these very clearly and explaining how they have sort of influenced my thinking in the Office for Research. So the first observation is that modern research requires far more collaboration. So when I started as a graduate student, I think the classic sort of university model was individual investigators, they had a lab, they're kind of an island unto themselves, and they succeed or fail based on how clever they are. I think today, universities and research is much more about building effective teams. There's much more interdisciplinary research. You need to build teams effectively. You need to sort of support teams in your research enterprise. The second trend that I'll talk to you today is that we're overwhelmed with data. And this is across the entire research enterprise, not just in the sciences or engineering, but even in the arts and humanities, in digital humanities. Data is exploding. And I think this is something that we have to actually grapple with. And then the modern workplace is changing. I mean, the pandemic has accelerated changes in how we think about work, whether we work remotely, work on site, what is the nature of work. And so the question I have been asking, and our team has been asking, is, well, how do we maximize and democratize research opportunities? And I think there's three key ideas that I want to speak to. The first is forming partnerships, because you can't move forward unless you form partnerships. Just as Secretary Bridges just spoke to in New Jersey, we've got to get really good at forming partnerships. We have to grapple with this data that I mentioned. And then policy. And I'll go through each one of these in detail. So partnerships. So partnerships ultimately drive diversity and inclusive ideas. And in fact, the opposite of when you think of why have people been excluded, it's because they've not been included in partnership. They've not been included into organizations. And so there are many types of partnerships. There's one-to-one partnerships, there's one-to-many, there's many-to-many. Certainly at a large institution like Rutgers, there are very many complicated, there are many partnerships And it's sort of when you ask, what is Rutgers' relationship with Johnson & Johnson, for example? Well, Johnson & Johnson is an enormous industry, right? I mean, they're an enormous company. They have parts of their company that don't necessarily even have relationships with each other. Rutgers is an enormous institution. We have all sorts of relationships with Johnson & Johnson. So one of the ideas is just trying to grapple and get a sense of who are our partners across a large institution, I think is something that universities are grappling with. So how do you form a good partnership? And I think the first step, and from my perspective, the first step in forming a good partnership is figure out what your team does. What are your key functions of your team? And then really understand what are your interests. What are you trying to achieve? And then you got to do the next step, which is you don't talk about yourself. You actually go to your partner, or you have a prospective partner, and you have to ask yourself, what are their unique functions? What are their interests? And then you really listen. And that's really, I think, the key thing, is that it's not talking about what you want or what your interests are. It's really listening and trying to understand what the partner's interests are. And I've actually had this happen since I have arrived at Rutgers. We have a very productive relationship with Colgate, a Colgate-Rutgers Alliance, which has been going on for a number of years. And in one of my first meetings, I asked our Colgate colleagues, what are your interests? And they were very surprised to hear that question come to them. And it led to a really interesting dialogue. And it helped us clarify, they want to do research, they want to access graduate students, they want to provide experiential learning to undergraduate students. It provided a lot of focus, and it helped us, and I think it's actually sort of supercharging that relationship. And that's sort of the approach that we want to use at Rutgers, is we want to ask, what are the interests of our external partners? So let me give a few examples now of how we've partnered across Rutgers and how we're advancing technology transfer. So, sorry, I flipped over a slide. So, Rutgers commercialization funding. So one of the key things, Tatiana's team, Tatiana Litvin-Vechnik, who leads Innovation Ventures team, we partner with faculty. Her team leads this effort. And a lot of times a faculty member will have an invention or have some idea, and they might want to turn into a company, but they need like a little extra time, a little extra money to actually turn that into a prototype, say, or to make it something that could be applied for an SBIR or STR grant. And this is a partnership between researchers and the Office for Research. We've invested $7.9 million in these sorts of partnerships, and we generated those funds through partnerships with Rutgers alums and other key stakeholders. And there's been 95 different companies. Is there any way to move the image off the slide? Because it's, I realize it's, well, there's been 95 different companies that have arisen from Rutgers because of this partnership. That's fantastic. Thank you. Since 2017. So this is something very successful and something that we really want to grow. We're actually looking to try to get more outside and partnerships outside of Rutgers to help advise us and guide us in these sorts of activities. Judith and CSIT has financial support for startups. Here's an example where we have close partnerships with the state of New Jersey, from the governor on down. This is a key relationship. This is a program from CSIT to support companies engaged with federal SBIR, STR grants, providing funding. This is something that we can make sure that our investigators know about, that we identify the best candidates, we send them and make them aware of these sorts of programs. We partner with all our academic institutions across the state of New Jersey. New Jersey is a small state. We should be really good at partnering. We are not limited by geography. And so this gives one example, NSF I-Corps, where a grant that's funded by the National Science Foundation. We're a partner in this, and the goals of this are to actually train researchers on how to be entrepreneurial, provide them that support and experience. Because I can tell you, most researchers, we're not trained to do this. I was never trained to do this work. And in fact, most of my focus is focused on my next grant and how do I get my next grant funded, because that's what I need to get promoted. And so we need to be very conscious and very deliberate about the types of activities that we pursue and offer these, because there are faculty who actually are extraordinarily entrepreneurial, and we want to foster that. And then finally, I wanted to suggest a vision for core services in New Jersey. We had a statewide conference back in June where we brought together core services from all the, many of the universities, I think almost all the universities in New Jersey, held a conference at Rutgers. And so core services, just to step back, it turns out our universities, we invest in hugely capital-intensive, expensive platforms that are really quite useful, and there's often some capacity. So it might be DNA sequencing, it could be mass spectrometers, it could be something in material sciences, it's libraries. There's just lots of things that we invest in. And the question is, can we make those widely available to the broad community, the people of the state of New Jersey, for their startup company? And we've had some innovative financial support from CSIT for supporting small companies to come use our core services. And I'm very interested in expanding this vision with the NJDA, where we enhance the discoverability of core services on Research with New Jersey, which Judith mentioned during her remarks earlier. And then thinking of this idea of we organize core services, not just to provide the particular service, but to really supercharge how do we hire, how do we retain faculty, how do we build teams more effectively around these sorts of platforms. And so I think of core services a bit like an iPhone or a PC, right? The iPhone is an amazing device, but what's really remarkable is what people can do with it. And that's sort of what we in universities need to be developing. Okay, and again, I think gaining strategic clarity is really essential for this. Oops. So again, experiments. I said I'd like to do experiments. We like to be innovative. Here's a very interesting experiment being led by Tatiana and my team, where Innovation Ventures is working with Keene, Montclair State, NJCU, Ramapo, Stockton, all the other public universities to provide technology transfer services and ask how can we unite around that. So it doesn't make sense for there may be great ideas in these smaller universities that they can benefit from Rutgers' size because we have a lot of expertise in technology transfer. And so rather than duplicating a technology transfer infrastructure at each one of these universities, can we partner with them and have one technology transfer research infrastructure that serves all the state of New Jersey? And I think this is very much aligned with Secretary Bridges' comments of how do we partner more effectively and do so in smart ways. This would directly contribute to the expansion of the New Jersey innovation ecosystem, provide support for schools that they may not have, and there probably are great ideas. I'm certain there are great ideas in these universities that might never see the light of day if they don't actually get this sort of support. The Rutgers Relationship Hub. So I mentioned all those complex relationships. I mentioned Rutgers and Johnson & Johnson, and one of the things that we're really working on right now is getting a university-wide customer relations management software and collecting that information so that we can understand what is the nature of relationships that we have. I am a data-informed person, and when it comes to relationships, we're kind of flying in the blind right now. I discover things all the time that we have these connections. We want to be much more systematic and strategic. We have computers. We ought to be able to do this. And so this is actually an important initiative. And one of the things I think as a university-wide organization is we're not the doers of this, but we are the connectors. So when something comes to us and we say, oh, this is an opportunity for a student experiential learning in fintech, we want to send it up to my good friend Jeff Robinson, who just walked in, the provost from Rutgers Newark, and say, hey, Jeff, we have a fintech opportunity with this company. Can we connect this with Newark students? There may be philanthropic opportunities, there may be sponsored research, but really I think the key insight is, can we capture that opportunity? Can we direct it to the right place in our large organization? And can we be much more strategic in building and maintaining these relationships? And finally, as Secretary Bridges mentioned, this New Jersey Innovation Technology Hub, which is in development in New Jersey, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, which includes space for renovation. So it's a 12-story building. The 12th story is an animal vivarium, but floors 9 through 11 are going to be innovation technology, research incubator, accelerator space. We are going to be running Rutgers and my office of research are going to be setting up an auxiliary to actually run that space. And so we really look to that to be a real center for Rutgers innovation and for partnership with external partners across the entire state of New Jersey. And I think there's tremendous opportunity in that space. The other floors in the building are going to house the Rutgers, the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and there'll be preclinical research going on in that building. So definitely a heavy life sciences focus. But that's developing, and if you have ideas about incubators or accelerators or things that you think are missing in the New Jersey ecosystem, please bring them to Tatiana and me, because we're very much in the idea and information gathering stage, and we'd really welcome feedback and ideas around this. Okay, so that's partnerships. Now I want to talk a little bit about data. So data really has to inform who we are and where we're going to go. And I don't say that we're data-driven. I know a lot of people like to use that word, but I don't think data drives us anywhere. Data doesn't force us to make decisions. But we want to be data-informed. We have to have data to make decisions, to do experiments. And we live in a world where data is exploding. And I wanted to share a little anecdote from my science. So I'm a human geneticist, as I said, but I was trained in Drosophila population genetics. Oh, this slide's not quite fitting on the screen, but I can go through this quickly. So this is a paper from 1983. The author was Marty Kreitman. He was a postdoc at Harvard. He later became a faculty member at Princeton, and then was a longtime faculty member at the University of Chicago. And he did this amazing experiment where he sequenced 11 alleles of 3,200 base pairs long of a gene in Drosophila, where there was a very famous amino acid replacement event, a fast, slow polymorphism. It was sort of historical, well-known, had been characterized. He did this incredibly arduous experiment, and if I can get into details of molecular biology, but it was really hard to sequence then. You basically had to isolate a single chromosome, then you had to clone it, then you had to subclone it, and you had to run this out on acrylamide gels, and you had to read the gels one at a time. It was incredibly laborious. But it was the best data set in the world for a decade. And more people got their PhDs off analyzing that data set than I can tell you. And it was an astounding technical achievement. So I started graduate school in 1993, and ABI sequencers were just hitting the market. And I think universities began to face this issue around core services. So core services hadn't really existed prior to this. But suddenly we had these sequencers that made sequencing a lot easier, but everybody needed it, but no one could use it fully to its full capacity. So you had to have a different way of organizing the technologies in genetics. And so what did we do? We ended up building these enormous factories to do large-scale sequencing, and within 10 years, we had sequenced a human genome, which is 3 billion base pairs of sequence. We built multiple large factories, and there was this decreasing cost, increasing capacity, and it was a large engineering, taking established technology and just getting organized and applying it at scale. And so on the left part of this graph, you can sort of see a paper from 2003 written by Francis Collins, who was the former director of the NIH, describing the cost per base. And you can see it was dropping in sort of a linear fashion, and the amount of DNA in public databases that was going up in a linear fashion. And then I want to point your attention to something that happens on this graph. So this is about 7 years later this paper's written, and you suddenly see that something happens around 2002. So what happened around 2002? So there's a company called 454 who no longer exists, but they develop a way to do sequencing by synthesis in a massively parallel way. So you can basically take what that factory used to do, and you can now do it on a microscope slide, and you can generate an enormous amount of data. And companies like Illumina now have adopted similar, there's been different approaches, but the notion is very similar. Make it parallel, miniaturize it, and suddenly what's happened in my field of genetics is the cost started to drop down at an exponential rate. The amount of data started to go up at an exponential rate. In fact, the human genome cost $1 per base. Today it's something like 0.000001 cent per base if you wanted to sequence a human genome. A genome is today, for research genomes, around $1,000. It's about $100 of computing. And like 2 weeks ago, there were machines announced by Illumina that pushed that price down to $100 per genome. Now, the clinical use of genomics data is often the big cost driver now, is how do you get people to interpret and analyze the data. But what's striking is that this pattern is in fact faster than Moore's law with microcircuits. It has actually increased. And I tell this story because this obviously influenced the way I think about data and influenced my scientific work. But this is not a trend that is unique to genetics. This similar trend is happening in every area of research, scholarship, and creative endeavors that is going on at our universities. And I think this is why we really have to grapple with the data question. So what am I doing? What are we doing in the Office for Research? So one of the key things is we have all sorts of data, all sorts of databases, and we're trying to actually grab that data, make sense of it, and help it tell us a story. We want to do things like measure, analyze, and inform so that we're making rational decisions. We're not just guessing. So we can do thoughtful experiments. And so now we have data, for example, I can track, well, this is how many sponsored awards we had over the last 5 years. This is the amount of the value of those awards. We can track the trend, and we now track this every month. It shows up in my email. I get this sent automatically after we close our books every month now. And now I can share this broadly with all my colleagues across all 4 chancellor-led units. And now we all have a much better sense of where are our strengths, where are our weaknesses, where should we be investing in terms of our sponsored award portfolio. Oops. So where do we need to go with data? And I want to suggest that one of the challenges is we have so much data that we have to actually understand our data. And we have to use our data to tell a story. Right? I mean, and you've got to be explain it in sort of a simple, clear way. The data, it's got to be transparent. It's got to be able to be clearly articulated. And I think increasingly, we're going to have to adopt computing technology like artificial intelligence to help us really find the patterns and help us tell that story. And this is a really cool example where we can use data to encourage innovation. So one of my teams in the Office for Research, we provide animal care services to the entire university. So we have 26,000 cages of mice. Okay, we have enormous, in 22 different facilities. And our cages, right now, animal care practice requires that people go look at the cages and make sure the mice are well fed, they have water, they're active. And this is an experiment we're starting to do where you can buy smart cages. And so smart cages can actually use sensors and AI to actually look at the activity of the mice, look at the food, look at the water, and remove effectively 2 hours of labor from 118 people across your organization every day, which ends up being an enormous cost saving. And as an added benefit now, scientists can actually do experiments on these data. So there are published reports of mouse models of motor neuron disease like ALS, a mouse model, where in fact this sort of data is actually able to begin to detect the presentation of a human, of the mouse version of a human disease well in advance of clear physical symptoms being observed. They actually start moving a little bit less. And so you can actually do really interesting behavioral experiments just by building it into your infrastructure. I feel like this is the sort of area where we need to be going as a university. How do we build sort of smart buildings, smart infrastructure? How do we use data to really help advance our research enterprise and serve many needs? This is sort of a force multiplier idea that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Okay, policy. Now, policy may seem a little bit boring, but I think actually policy is really essential. And let me explain why this is. So we are really good at developing habits. Bad habits, all kinds of habits. I mean, I think the pandemic has really brought home to me, before the pandemic, how many of us ever went on a Zoom meeting or ever thought of working remotely? And now, I think we're in the habit of saying, Zoom is really easy. We should just have Zoom meetings. I think we've almost lost the ability to meet in person or have symposiums like this and get the benefit of interpersonal interaction. So imagine that habit forming, and now put in context the broad issues with inclusion that have been going on in our society for hundreds of years. We have developed bad habits, and we have to be very conscious, and we have to figure out how do we change these habits? How do we become more proactive? And I think the way to do this is to develop policies that are simple and clear and be very explicit and hold yourself accountable to those policies. Because I think in the absence of policies, people revert back to unconscious behaviors and bad habits, and we don't actually achieve our ideals. So let me talk a little bit about how we're pursuing this at Rutgers. So one of the first things I did in the Office for Research is work with my leadership team, work with our staff, and develop a diversity strategic plan. And we aligned it with Rutgers priorities, but we have a very clear plan. These are our things that we're particular policies that we're pursuing. One of the innovations is I have a DEI council, which is a collection of staff selected sort of at random from across my organization. I meet with them once a quarter. I've given them a charge to work on a couple issues, but they can bring anything they want to me. And they have connection right to the leader of the Office for Research. I think having a very clear plan and owning that plan, right? This is the Office for Research's plan. I think far too often we think of, well, DEI, we hired somebody, that's their job. Their job is to inform us and educate us, but our job is through policy to implement it in our organizations. And I think that's a really important, for me, that's been an important insight and an important approach to this problem. For our inventors, we now have a unified patent policy. And this is something that happened before I arrived here. Tatiana it finished when I arrived, but Tatiana took this on for 2 years, required enormous convening and discussions across the entire institution. But we now have a unified, organized, simple way to manage intellectual property that benefits faculty and benefits Rutgers faculty. And that is an enormous step forward for the institution. And getting back to my notion of democratizing access, a simple university-wide policy like this democratizes access. Everybody can access this policy, can be supported through this means. It provides an equitable revenue distribution. It provides funds from an invention, from licensing, back to the academic units. It provides funds directly to the individual investigators, so they are motivated. They get 35% of licensing revenue specifically. And it has improved support for commercialization activities, such as patenting and licensing, and tech advance, for example, which is where the funding we're using for startup companies at Rutgers. So I think this is like an example where a unified policy in the technology space can really advance our interests and advance equity and opportunity across Rutgers. Tenure and promotion. As I mentioned earlier, how do faculty get promoted? I get promoted by writing papers and writing grants. Do I get promoted for being innovative or having a startup company or having patents? Not so much, but we've actually now started to build this into our tenure packages so that when a faculty member is going up for promotion, they include this. And faculty say, hey, I have these patents, or I've done these innovation activities. And we're having a broad discussion really led by my boss, Prabhas Mogi, the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, where we really begin to ask, okay, these are important attributes of our universities. That the faculty, the way the faculty life cycle, what a faculty member does is not necessarily so narrowly prescribed anymore, that innovation is actually a really important part of our job. And we're not saying that everybody is going to start a business, but we want to have an alternative and say there's some people who may be very skilled at this space. This may offer lots of benefits to the institution, so we want to make sure that people get proper credit for that work and that effort. So a facilities and administrative cost recovery policy. Okay, that's a real large mouthful. Let me just explain what this is. So when investigators, when institutions do research, they incur costs. We take those costs, we send them to our sponsors, often say the federal government, and they give us money back at some percent of the costs that we incurred. So there are real costs to research. Research is not a money-making enterprise. We have to keep buildings, got to keep the lights on, we got to support laboratories, got to support our organization. So one of the things at Rutgers that I discovered when I arrived, and I've been at Rutgers a little over a year, is that there was no unified policy about how this F&A was distributed across the organization. And it turns out this is really important, and faculty really care about this because this is how their school gets supported, how their particular, and so the absence of a policy was a real barrier to collaboration because people said, I don't want to collaborate. I want to keep all the money here in my school. I don't see any benefit to me. And they got involved in some complicated MOU processes where they would negotiate where the FAA was going to go, and it was really inefficient. So we have pushed forward a policy. It dramatically simplifies this, and I think it's going to actually really help collaboration so that if you collaborate with someone from another school and you do half the work, you get half the F&A, boom, it's automatic and it's very simple. And I think that the simple idea is that the F&A should follow where the costs are incurred for doing the research. And so we're implementing that now. But I think that's an important step forward, particularly for a large institution like Rutgers that has so many, we have 29 different decanal units and we have institutes, and you need to build that confidence to say, okay, the financial back end is going to work. Let's just focus on the science, because we didn't hire faculty to worry about F&A cost recovery. We hired them to do great research scholarship and other creative endeavors. So finally, how to get involved. So as I mentioned, we are really very open to partnerships. We welcome feedback and ideas. I've listed here a number of opportunities to get involved. We definitely always need tech advance, health advance reviewers. So these are reviewers of our startup companies to ask whether they're worthy of support or how should we support them. We are definitely very actively trying to build connections with the broader business community to have entrepreneurs from outside Rutgers help advise us and help advise our teams, and so we're really open to that. Building this sort of external advisory committee, because I think we don't want to be siloed. We really want to understand, what do our partners want? What do they want out of Rutgers? How should we design Rutgers to be, to achieve the governor's vision of an innovation economy in New Jersey? And we love to have presenters at seminars and boot camps. If you have particular areas of expertise or ideas, and certainly you should reach out to Tatiana today or innovate@research.rutgers.edu. And then I will stop right there. You can email me directly if you have any questions or feedback, and I would love to take any questions. And thank you very much for listening to the keynote.
Looking at from a statewide perspective to have sort of a state intellectual property policy. I think Massachusetts had something similar that we had looked at a number of years. I'd like your kind of comments on how that might make it easier for companies to then work with all of our state institutions, so they don't say, I'm talking to NJIT and they're saying this, and I'm talking to Rutgers and they're saying that, and Rowan, yet something else again.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I'll say our policy is on the Rutgers Policy Library, so anyone can download it and read it today, so we're totally glad to share that. We are all separate legal entities, so we have to sort of discuss and negotiate this, but I think certainly sharing best practices, and if we could arrive at sort of common, Tatiana can speak to this. It took a lot of effort on her part and a lot of convening to get this policy established as it is, and that policy, NJIT may have a different idea for what they want their policy to be than does Rutgers. But at the same time, there may be common practices, there may be, I think there are opportunities in this space. And so I certainly think it's an interesting idea worth exploring. Yes?
Hi, great presentation. I was just wondering if you're open to partnering with private universities as well. Because Innovation Ventures is working with smaller universities. I think that privates would be very interested in collaborating as well. I'm from St. Peter's.
Yeah, I certainly think we would be open to discussing that, yes. I mean, we are Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and so I feel like the name is the mission, that we really want to represent all the people of New Jersey. And so I think whether, obviously the state university are obvious partners because we're all part of the state system, but you're a resident of New Jersey, we want to partner with you. And so I feel like we all have to work together to achieve the vision for New Jersey. So.
Good morning. So I want to hear you say some more about the hub and how that may factor in more into sort of what was said earlier and your ideas around collaboration across different universities when it comes to innovation for the state.
Yeah. So the hub so I see the hub as a potential real game changer for New Jersey. It's the 9th, 10th, 11th floor of the hub. Each floor is around 30,000 square feet. And so one of the problems I know we face at Rutgers right now is I'm an investigator, I have an idea, I might want to start a company. I have to actually get that idea out of my laboratory to someplace else because for compliance purposes, I can't combine that work. I can't do that work in my NIH-funded laboratory. I have to do it someplace else because it's a separate legal entity. And so I think the need for incubator accelerator space in the New Brunswick region is actually really needed. Now, we're really doing a business search right now, Jeffrey. I'm trying to figure out where do we fit as a niche. Like Friday, I'm going to Bristol-Myers Squibb to look at their incubator accelerator space. NJEDA has space on Route 1, which I think, and we don't want to duplicate that, but I think the NJEDA space on Route 1 is actually, typically comes in like 800 square foot. And it's a little bit more, It's for companies that are a little bit further along in their development. And so I think this is sort of the question from the faculty perspective that we want to discuss. Now, there's a much broader question, I think, for the state of New Jersey and for companies that are in New Jersey, are how might we pull companies into the hub and solve their problems? Or, Prudential may be a company, for example, who may be doing innovative activities. Would a company like Colgate or a company like Prudential, would they want to actually have some of their innovation work done in this sort of facility, or would they wish to sponsor that? I think there's a way to build those relationships. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in that space. I think we're really at the stage now where we're trying to figure out the business model and how do we maximize the impact, how do we see what's being done in other states. And we're very much in the data gathering stage. So we are, and I will certainly welcome your feedback and ideas to think about this. Because I think, we don't want it just for faculty. We really see this as a site where there can be great partnerships with companies. There's companies that actually are committed to having space. There's academic partners. Princeton is in there. I mean, I think this could really be, I hope it's going to be the center for technology transfer at Rutgers. And so certainly my hope is to move Tatiana's whole team to that location. It's right next to the train station, and it would make a lot of our technologies much easier to access. And so again, this is the sort of thing where a partnership across the state really, there could be many partners that could really benefit from this activity.
Thank you, Mike. That was a very nice presentation. I'm Jose Lopez from Seton Hall University. So I have a question. So the paradigm is shifting. Entrepreneurship is the big thing now when it comes to research. So where in your mind, may I ask you, does basic research fall in? I mean, research universities in particular, or universities in general, have always been hubs for thinking about the long term. Entrepreneurship is not necessarily about the long term. So where does fundamental basic research fall into the equation in this new innovation, entrepreneurship economy that you're professing about?
Yeah, I actually think, so I'm a basic researcher. I think basic research is foundational. I think that is our core mission. I see the entrepreneurial activity, I don't see us changing our core mission, but I see us as adding an opportunity or adding opportunities for faculty to pursue different directions and translational impact of their research that maybe didn't exist in the past. So I think basic research is incredibly important, and I think there's so many. The litany of discoveries that started out with some unusual observation in the laboratory that characterized something. I mean, in my field, CRISPR-Cas9, which is a defense mechanism used by bacteria to chop up DNA from phage that are trying to attack it, is now being used for genome editing, and it's going to probably dramatically transform our life. Right? That was a real basic research, and certainly as these sorts of things are recognized by the Nobel Prize. So I think they're really central. I see this as an addition, not replacing what we're doing as basic research. Much like when we offer graduate students and postdocs now more diverse career path opportunities. I think in graduate education we're trying much more. We're not just saying, oh, the only career path for a graduate student is to replicate me and become a scientist and become an academic. We want people to say that's one path, but you might also work for a company, you might work for the government. There may be lots of career paths, and so I see it as optional rather than replacing. And I think it's an addition. So I hope it will enrich the broader research enterprise.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker
Thank
here.
you.